Hey there. Good to see you and hope you enjoy the new story. Subscribe and like the story. When I was a kid, I always imagined retirement as a golden age of freedom. Fishing trips, slow mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, and afternoons spent with a woman I'd grown old with. For a while, it was just that peaceful, predictable, and exactly what I thought I wanted. Clara and I moved to this little coastal town 5 years ago, leaving behind the noise and pace of city life. Our days fell into a comfortable rhythm, one I never questioned. Maybe that was my mistake. Every morning, I woke up early, slipped on my boots, and headed down to the dock before sunrise. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for me, it was therapy. There's something about the stillness of the water at dawn, the way the world feels like it's holding its breath. I'd stand there with my line in the water, letting the cool breeze carry away any stray worries. Clara, on the other hand, had found her place among the town's bustling community groups. She was always organizing charity bake sales, teaching art classes, or hosting book clubs in our living room. She thrived on the social energy, and I thought I understood that about her. While I preferred solitude, she craved connection. I figured it balanced out. She had her world, and I had mine. At least, that's how I used to see it. Looking back now, there were signs, little things I dismissed as unimportant, like how she started coming home later from her meetings, or how she suddenly seemed more invested in her appearance. New dresses, different hairstyles, makeup she hadn't bothered with in years. I thought maybe she was just rediscovering herself. God knows I wasn't the most attentive husband, but we were comfortable, and I figured that was enough. One morning, as I packed my tackle box, Clara stopped me in the kitchen. She was wearing a floral dress I hadn't seen before, her silver-streaked hair pinned back neatly. She smiled at me, her brown eyes warm but distracted. "Heading out early again?" she asked, leaning against the counter with her coffee. "Yep, weather's perfect for it today," I replied, tightening the straps on my gear. "You've got the book club later, right?" "Actually, I'm meeting with the art group. We're planning an exhibition," she said, her tone light but rehearsed. "That sounds nice," I said, not giving it much thought. It was one of 100 things she'd mentioned over breakfast in the past few months. I gave her a quick kiss on the cheek and headed out the door, thinking about nothing but the water and the fish I hoped to catch. That was my routine. Mornings at the dock, afternoons cleaning and cooking the catch, and evenings spent in quiet companionship with Clara. She'd curl up with a book, and I'd watch old movies or read fishing magazines. It wasn't thrilling, but it was ours. Or so I thought. It's strange how easily you can overlook the cracks when you don't want to see them. Like the way Clara's laughter had started sounding forced, or how she'd often check her phone during dinner, turning it face down when she set it back on the table. I told myself it was nothing. What did I have to worry about? We'd been married for over 35 years, raised 2 wonderful kids, and survived all the ups and downs life had thrown at us. We were solid, weren't we? One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Clara came into the kitchen, her voice unusually hesitant. "Aaron," she began, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. "Do you ever feel like we've settled too much? Like we're stuck in a routine?" I looked up from the sink, surprised. "What do you mean? I thought we liked our routine." She gave a small, strained smile. "We do. I do. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if we're missing something." It was such an odd thing for her to say that I didn't know how to respond. I shrugged, trying to keep the mood light. "Missing what? A skydiving hobby?" She laughed softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe," she said, and kissed me on the cheek before heading to the living room. I stood there for a while, watching the suds swirl down the drain, her words replaying in my mind. Missing something? I didn't ask her about it again, though I probably should have. Instead, I let it slip into the background noise of our life, chalking it up to one of those fleeting thoughts everyone has now and then. But it wasn't fleeting for Clara. It was the first tremor before the earthquake, and I was too blind or too comfortable to see it coming. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Clara's steady breathing, I thought about how lucky I was to have her. I didn't realize that she might not feel the same. The next few weeks felt different. It wasn't anything Clara said outright, but I started noticing things. She spent more time out of the house, always with some excuse. A meeting with her art group, lunch with a friend, errands that seemed to stretch well into the evening. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Clara was social, always had been. That was part of what I loved about her. But then there were the phone calls. It started subtly. Clara stepping out of the room to answer her phone, her voice dropping to a low, secretive tone. Once, I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and caught her mid-conversation. She flinched when she saw me and quickly ended the call. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Oh, just Marcy," she said with a wave of her hand. She wanted to talk about the fundraiser next month. Marcy, Clara's go-to name for covering anything and everything. I nodded, not wanting to seem suspicious, but a knot had already formed in my stomach. It wasn't just the phone calls. She started dressing up more often, even when she wasn't going anywhere special. Her favorite pair of comfortable flats were replaced by sleek heels. She'd come home with shopping bags from boutiques I didn't recognize, claiming she'd found a great deal on a new dress or some jewelry. Clara had always cared about her appearance, but this felt different. One Saturday, I decided to skip my usual fishing trip. The forecast called for rain, and I thought it might be nice to spend the morning with Clara. When I mentioned it over breakfast, she froze for a moment, her fork hovering midair. "You're not going fishing?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Nah, figured I'd take a break today. Maybe we could go out for lunch later." She hesitated, then smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That sounds nice. But I promised the art group I'd help with the exhibit today. Rain or shine." "Of course," I said, forcing a grin. "Another time, then?" She nodded and quickly changed the subject, but her reaction lingered with me. Why did she seem so uneasy? As the rain poured that morning, I stayed in the house, reading the newspaper and trying not to think too hard about anything. Around 11, Clara emerged from the bedroom, dressed in a fitted blouse and a pair of jeans that looked brand new. Her hair was styled, her makeup subtle but polished. She kissed me on the cheek as she grabbed her purse. "Don't wait up," she said with a quick smile before disappearing out the door. I watched her leave, the sound of her car engine fading into the distance. For the first time, I felt a twinge of something I hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Later that week, I decided to pay a visit to Marcy. If Clara was spending so much time working on this exhibit, Marcy, her close friend and the leader of the art group, would surely know all about it. I stopped by her house under the pretense of dropping off some leftover fish from my last trip. "Hey, Aaron." Marcy greeted me warmly. "What brings you by?" "Just thought I'd share the bounty," I said, handing her the neatly wrapped package. "Clara tells me you've been busy with the art exhibit." Marcy frowned slightly, looking confused. "Art exhibit? What art exhibit?" I blinked. "The one Clara's been helping with. She's been talking about it nonstop." "Oh," Marcy said, her face clearing. "She hasn't mentioned that to me. Must be something separate from the group. You know Clara. She's always juggling a million things." I nodded, trying to mask my confusion. Marcy's response didn't sit right with me, but I didn't press further. Instead, I made small talk before leaving, my thoughts swirling. If Clara wasn't spending her time with the art group, where was she? That Friday, I decided to stay up later than usual. Clara had gone out with her friends again, promising she'd be home by 10. When the clock hit midnight, she still wasn't back. I sat on the couch, the TV playing quietly in the background, my eyes glued to the door. At 12:30, I heard her car pull into the driveway. A minute later, she walked through the door, her cheeks flushed and the faint scent of perfume and wine clinging to her clothes. "You're late," I said evenly. She looked startled to see me still awake. "Oh, Aaron, I thought you'd be asleep. I stayed up." She gave me a sheepish smile, slipping off her shoes. "Sorry, we lost track of time." "Who's we?" The question came out sharper than I intended. Her smile faltered. "Just the girls from the group." I nodded slowly, the knot in my stomach tightening. She brushed past me, heading to the bedroom, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was yet, but I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. The next morning, Clara's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. I glanced at the screen out of habit and froze. "David, last night was amazing. Let me know when you're free again." The air left my lungs. My hand trembled as I set the phone back down, my mind racing. Who was David? What had happened last night? When Clara came back into the kitchen, her hair wrapped in a towel, she saw me sitting at the table, staring into my coffee. "You okay?" she asked, her voice light. I looked up at her, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired. But I wasn't okay. Not even close. I couldn't sleep that night." Clara was next to me, breathing deeply, peacefully, like nothing had changed. I stared at the ceiling, my mind looping through 100 scenarios, each worse than the last. Who was David? What exactly did amazing mean? I told myself it could be innocent. Maybe he was a friend from the art group, someone she'd leaned on for support. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I just didn't want to face it. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Over breakfast, Clara hummed to herself while buttering her toast, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I sipped my coffee, studying her. She looked happy, a kind of carefree happiness I hadn't seen in years. Not with me, anyway. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "Got plans today?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just the usual," she said, not looking up. "Might run a few errands, maybe stop by the community center." I nodded, pretending to be absorbed in my coffee. But I'd already decided I wasn't going to let this go. Clara left around 10. 15 minutes later, I grabbed my jacket and followed. Her routine had become predictable, but today I was done taking her word for it. I kept my distance, my old sedan blending into the other cars on the road as she drove through town. She didn't go to the community center. Instead, she turned into the parking lot of a small cafe I'd never seen her mention. I pulled into a spot far enough away to avoid being noticed, but close enough to see. My stomach twisted as I watched her get out of the car, adjusting her scarf and glancing at her reflection in the window. She was smiling. A man walked up to her, mid-30s tall, with neatly combed hair and a confident stride. Clara's smile widened when she saw him. They greeted each other warmly, and I saw the way his hand lingered on her back as they walked into the cafe together. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I didn't need to see anything else. This was it. Proof. When Clara came home later that afternoon, I was in the living room, waiting. She walked through the door, humming a tune under her breath, and stopped short when she saw me sitting there. "You're home early," she said, her voice carefully casual. "I didn't go fishing," I replied, my tone flat. "Oh, why not?" I held her gaze, my jaw tightening. "Because I spent the morning watching you meet David." Her face froze, her carefully constructed mask slipping for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," I said sharply, standing up. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. I saw you, Clara, at the cafe. With him." She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, her cheeks flushing. Finally, she sighed and sank into the armchair across from me. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice low. I laughed bitterly, pacing the room. "That's what they always say, isn't it? It's not what you think." "Then tell me, Clara, what is it? Who is he?" Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and for the first time in years, she looked small, almost fragile. "He's a friend." "A friend?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Do your friends send you texts about how amazing last night was?" Her eyes widened. "You went through my phone?" It was buzzing right in front of me. I snapped. "Don't turn this around on me. I'm not the one sneaking around." She pressed her lips together, looking down at her hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "What wasn't supposed to be like this?" "Meeting another man behind my back? Lying to me?" She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "Aaron, I didn't plan for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you?" I asked, my voice breaking despite myself. "Why, Clara? After everything we've been through, why?" Her tears spilled over, and she wiped them away hastily. "I don't know. I just felt so lost, like I wasn't myself anymore. David, he made me feel alive again." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "And I didn't?" She shook her head quickly. "It's not that. It's just, with you everything is so steady, so predictable. I felt like I was disappearing." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Steady. Predictable. I thought those were good things. I'd thought that's what a marriage was supposed to be. So you decided to find someone who wasn't steady, I said, my voice hollow. Someone exciting. It wasn't about him, she said quickly. It was about me. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You found yourself. Aaron. No, I cut her off, my voice sharp. Don't try to explain this away. You cheated Clara. You broke us. She flinched, and for a moment, I thought she might fight back, argue, plead. But instead, she just nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry. That was it. The woman I'd spent my life with, who I thought I knew better than anyone, had torn our marriage apart, and all she had to say was sorry. I left the room without another word, slamming the bedroom door behind me. As I stood there, leaning against the doorframe, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of something entirely different, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. The next morning, the house felt impossibly quiet. I woke up to the faint smell of coffee, but the usual comfort it brought was missing. Clara was already in the kitchen when I walked in, her shoulders stiff, her expression guarded. She didn't say a word as I poured myself a cup and sat down at the table. The tension between us was unbearable. We need to tell the kids, I said finally, breaking the silence. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the sink. Aaron, I don't think that's necessary. Why drag them into this? Because they're our family, I replied, my voice firm. They deserve to know the truth. She sighed, turning to face me, her face pale. Fine, but can we at least do it together? I don't want them to think this is all my fault. I clenched my jaw, biting back the response that came to mind. Instead, I nodded curtly. Tonight. Call them over. By the time our son Jonathan and our daughter Mia arrived, the weight of the day had settled heavily on my chest. They were both in their 30s with busy lives of their own, but they dropped everything when Clara called, sensing the urgency. We sat in the living room, the four of us. Jonathan, a stoic type like me, perched on the edge of his seat, while Mia, always more emotional, clutched a mug of tea as if it were a lifeline. What's going on? Jonathan asked, his brow furrowed. You sounded serious, Mom. Clara glanced at me, then back at the kids. She took a deep breath. Your father and I, we've been having some problems. Jonathan frowned. What kind of problems? I cleared my throat, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Your mother's been seeing someone else. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mia's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth, while Jonathan leaned back, his jaw tightening. Wait, what? Mia stammered. Mom, is that true? Clara's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. It's complicated. Complicated? Jonathan's voice was cold. You cheated on Dad. What's complicated about that? I never stopped loving your father, Clara said quickly, her voice trembling. But I've been struggling and I made a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness out of my tone. Is that what we're calling it now? Stop, Mia said, her voice breaking. This can't be happening. You two are the reason I believed in marriage. How could you do this, Mom? Clara reached for her, but Mia pulled back, tears streaming down her face. Jonathan stood abruptly, pacing the room. So, what happens now? He asked, his tone clipped. Are you leaving? Are you staying? What's the plan? Clara looked at me, her eyes pleading. Aaron, I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know yet, but I do know that things can't go back to the way they were. The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over us like a heavy blanket. After the kids left, I sat alone in the living room, nursing a drink. Clara had retreated to the bedroom, her tears soft but constant as she closed the door behind her. I'd hoped that having the kids here would give me some clarity, but if anything, it had muddied the waters further. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was Mia. Dad, she said, her voice small. I need to talk to you. Go ahead, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I've been thinking, she began hesitantly. Mom, she made a horrible mistake. But I think she's been unhappy for a while, and maybe we didn't see it. Are you saying this is my fault? I asked, my voice tightening. No, she said quickly. But maybe you could try to understand where she's coming from. If there's a chance to fix this, shouldn't you at least try? Her words stung, and I couldn't hide the edge in my reply. I don't know if I can, Mia. This isn't just some rough patch. She broke our trust. I know, Mia said softly. But she's still Mom. And you're still the man who taught me what love looks like. Please just think about it. The next morning, Jonathan stopped by, his demeanor as serious as ever. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly. I've been thinking about what happened, he said, and I don't blame you for being angry. Hell, I'd feel the same. But Dad, we're family, and family means fighting for each other, even when it's hard. I stared at him, my chest tightening. You think I haven't fought? You think I don't want to fix this? I don't know, he admitted. But I do know that you've always been the strongest person I know. If anyone can figure out a way through this, it's you. I didn't respond right away. The weight of his words settled over me like a challenge, one I wasn't sure I was ready to face. That evening, Clara approached me hesitantly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Aaron, she began softly, I know I've hurt you, more than I can ever fix, but I want to try. Please, let's try. I looked at her, my heart a swirling mess of anger, hurt, and something else I couldn't quite name. The woman I'd loved for over 3 decades stood before me, asking for forgiveness. But could I give it? I didn't know the answer yet. All I knew was that the life we'd built together, the life I thought was unshakable, had been cracked wide open, and nothing would ever be the same. I didn't sleep after Clara's plea. Her words, asking to fix things, spun endlessly in my head. Forgiveness? How could I even begin to think about that after everything? I spent the night staring at the ceiling, thinking about her betrayal, about David. By morning, I knew one thing. I needed space. I'm heading to the lake for a few days, I said over breakfast. Clara, still pale and exhausted from the last few days, looked up sharply. For how long? She asked softly. Not sure, I replied, pushing my plate away. I need time to think. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. I understand. Did she? I wasn't sure. I packed my bag and drove to the cabin my father had left me years ago. Clara always hated the place, calling it too remote, but right now its solitude was exactly what I needed. The cabin was just as I remembered, dusty, quiet, and simple. I spent the first day keeping busy, chopping wood, repairing the roof, and cleaning out the fireplace. Anything to stop my thoughts from spinning. But no matter how much I worked, my mind kept drifting back to Clara's face when I confronted her. The excuses, the tears, the way she said she felt lost. What did that even mean? The second day, I found an old box of photographs stuffed in the closet. Most were from our early years, vacations, holidays, and moments I've forgotten about. One picture stopped me cold. Clara, laughing in the garden of our first home. She looked carefree, her smile wide and genuine. When was the last time I'd seen her smile like that? Had she changed so much, or had I just stopped noticing? By the third morning, I realized I wasn't just angry. I was tired of the questions, the second-guessing, the constant ache in my chest. I walked to the edge of the lake, cast my line into the still water, and tried to clear my mind. The rhythm of fishing helped, but it couldn't answer the biggest question. Could I ever trust Clara again? I caught a small perch, released it back into the water, and sat down on the dock, staring out at the ripples. For the first time in days, I admitted the truth to myself. Clara's actions were her own, but I hadn't helped. I'd taken our life for granted, assuming steady was enough. For her, it hadn't been. By the time I returned home, I had made my decision. Clara was sitting on the porch, her eyes red and puffy. She stood as I got out of the truck, her voice barely a whisper. Aaron, I wasn't sure if you were coming back. I needed time, I said, walking past her toward the door. And I got it. She followed me inside, her hands wringing nervously. And I turned to face her, my voice steadier than I felt. I can't forgive you right now, Clara. I don't even know if I can stay. Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. Aaron, please. You broke my trust, I interrupted. And trust is everything. I can't just pretend it didn't happen. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she nodded. I understand. I'm staying here for now, I said, my voice firm. But things are going to change. I need time to figure out what's next. For me. For us. Her voice broke as she whispered. And what happens to us? I sighed, the weight of her question sinking deep into my chest. I don't know, Clara. I honestly don't know. The words felt final, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of control return. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for now, that would have to be enough. The days after my return passed in silence. Clara and I moved around the house like strangers, careful not to cross paths. She still cooked meals, but I rarely joined her at the table. Instead, I ate alone in the den, staring blankly at the TV while pushing food around my plate. Neither of us spoke about the future, but the tension in the air made it clear we were both waiting for something to break. I spent most of my time outdoors. Mornings were for long walks along the cliffs by the ocean, where the sharp wind and crashing waves drowned out the noise in my head. Afternoons were for fixing up the shed or organizing tools I hadn't touched in years. It kept my hands busy, even if it did nothing for the heaviness in my chest. Clara, for her part, seemed to fade into the background. She stayed out of my way, busying herself with cleaning or reading, but I could feel her watching me. Sometimes, I'd catch her in the corner of my eye, her face lined with worry, as if she were waiting for a verdict she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The breaking point came on a Saturday. I woke early, as usual, and went into the kitchen for coffee. Clara was already there, standing at the sink, staring out the window. She turned when she heard me, her face pale and tired. "Aaron," she said softly, "we can't keep going like this." I sipped my coffee, watching her over the rim of the mug. "I know." She wrung her hands, her eyes pleading. "Then what do we do? Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." Her desperation hit me harder than I expected, but it didn't change what I needed to say. "It's not that simple, Clara. This isn't something you can just fix, and it's not something I can forgive, at least not now. But I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Doesn't that mean anything?" I set the mug down, my chest tight with frustration. "It does, but love isn't enough, not when trust is gone." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Aaron, for everything." "I know," I said quietly. And I did, but it wasn't enough. That evening, we had dinner with the kids. Jonathan and Mia arrived with their spouses, both trying to act like nothing was wrong. But the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Clara tried to make conversation, asking about work, about the grandkids, but her voice was brittle, and no one lingered on her questions. After dinner, as the dishes piled in the sink, I stood. "I need to say something." Everyone stopped, their eyes turning to me. Clara looked down at her hands, her face pale. "I've made a decision," I began, my voice steady. "I can't continue living like this, pretending everything's fine when it's not. Clara and we're not the same anymore. What happened has changed everything." Mia's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, please don't make any decisions you can't take back." "I'm not rushing into anything," I said firmly. "But I also can't ignore what's happened. I need to move forward, and I don't think that means staying here." Clara's head snapped up, her face stricken. "Aaron, I'm not leaving today," I said, cutting her off. "But I will leave. I've started making arrangements to move out. I'll stay long enough to sort things out with the house and with you. But after that, I need to go." The room fell silent. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Mia looked between Clara and me, tears streaking her cheeks. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice trembling. "There isn't," I replied gently. "I'm sorry, Mia, but this is what I need to do." That night, Clara knocked on the door to the guest room, where I'd been sleeping for weeks. She stood in the doorway, her face wet with tears. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is this really what you want?" I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "It's not what I want, but it's what I need." She nodded, her hands trembling. "I understand." For a moment, I thought she might say more, plead, argue, fight for what we had. But instead, she turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. In the weeks that followed, I started putting my plan into motion. I met with a lawyer, arranged for the sale of the house, and began looking for a small place in the nearby town. Clara stayed quiet, helping where she could, but never pushing. It was as if she had resigned herself to the inevitability of what was coming. The day I moved out was harder than I expected. Clara stood on the porch as I loaded the last of my boxes into the truck. She didn't cry, but her eyes were red, and her hands shook as she handed me a small envelope. "For you," she said softly. "Read it when you're ready." I nodded, tucking it into my jacket pocket. "Take care of yourself, Clara." "You too," she whispered. As I drove away, I didn't look back. My chest felt heavy, but for the first time in months, there was a small flicker of something else: relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to figure out. And for now, that was enough. The first night in my new place felt surreal. The small apartment I'd rented was nothing like the home Clara and I had shared for decades. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, and the air smelled faintly of fresh paint. But it was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was alone with my thoughts. I unpacked slowly, setting up only the essentials. A bed, a small table, and a single chair filled most of the space. The rest of the boxes remained stacked in the corner, waiting for a day when I felt like revisiting the past. In my jacket pocket, I found the envelope Clara had given me. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready for whatever words she had left me with. Eventually, curiosity won out, and I unfolded the neatly written letter. "Aaron, I don't know if this will mean anything to you, but I needed to write it. You've always been the better one at finding the right words, and I've always struggled to express what's in my heart. But here it is, for whatever it's worth. I'm sorry. I know I've said it before, but I need you to understand how deeply I mean it. I didn't just betray you. I betrayed everything we built together, everything we were. And for what? A fleeting distraction? A selfish attempt to fill a void I didn't even know how to name? You didn't deserve that. You've been my anchor, my partner, and my best friend for most of my life. I don't know who I am without you. And maybe that's part of the problem. I lost myself somewhere along the way. But that's no excuse for what I did. I know that now. I won't ask you to forgive me, because I know I haven't earned it. All I can ask is that you remember the good we had, the laughter, the love, the life we built together. I'll carry those memories with me always, and I hope you will too. Take care of yourself, Aaron. And if there's ever a day when you feel like we could talk again, I'll be here. With all my love, Clara." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I folded the letter and set it on the table, staring at it for a long time. I didn't know how to feel. The anger and hurt were still there, but so was something else, something softer, like the faint echo of the love we'd once shared. The next few weeks passed in a haze of new routines. I started waking up early again, taking long walks around the neighborhood, and stopping by the local diner for coffee. It wasn't the same as fishing at the lake or sitting with Clara over breakfast, but it was something. One morning, while sitting at the counter of the diner, a voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see a woman about my age, her gray-streaked hair tied back in a loose braid. She smiled warmly, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a book in the other. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing to the empty stool next to me. She set her things down and slid onto the stool. "I've seen you in here a few times," she said, stirring her coffee. "You new in town?" "Yeah," I said. "Moved here recently." "Well, welcome. I'm Evelyn." She extended her hand, and I shook it. "Aaron." She nodded, her eyes kind. "Nice to meet you, Aaron." We talked for a while about the town, the weather, and the best places to grab lunch. It was easy, comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. When she got up to leave, she smiled and said, "Maybe I'll see you around." "Maybe," I replied, watching as she walked out the door. Life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. I found small joys in the quiet moments. Reading on the balcony, watching the sunset, and learning how to cook for one. I stayed in touch with Jonathan and Mia, though the conversations were cautious, as if they were afraid to bring up Clara. One evening, Mia called to tell me that Clara had put the house up for sale. She said she's moving to a smaller place, Mia said hesitantly, closer to me and the kids. "That's good," I said, unsure what else to say. "Have you thought about calling her?" Mia asked gently. "No," I admitted. "Not yet. Maybe someday," she said softly. "I think she's hoping for that." I didn't respond. The truth was I didn't know if I could ever go back, even just as a friend. The wounds were still too fresh, the trust too broken. Months turned into a year, and life continued. I saw Evelyn at the diner more often, and our casual conversations slowly grew into something more. She was gentle and warm, with a quiet strength that reminded me of the man I used to be. One day, as we sat on a park bench overlooking the water, she asked, "Do you ever think about going back to the life you had before?" I thought about it for a long moment before shaking my head. "No," I said finally. "I think that chapter's closed." She smiled, placing a hand on mine. "Good? Because sometimes the best chapters are the ones you haven't written yet." That night, as I sat on my balcony watching the stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. My life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to see where it would take me.